Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this, our ultimate fifth evening together. For some of us who have been here for the entirety of the program, we're so excited to hear the end of what Rousseau and Emile and Professor Jensen have to share with us. So as a reminder, please feel free to send any questions in the chat as you think of them, and we'll save some time for them at the end. And without further ado, please take it away, Professor Jensen.
Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you all for joining in this evening. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts, maybe either on email or with respect to questions sent to Kim. Book 5, we are nearing the 7th day of creation, and the final words in the Emile are spoken by Emile, and he says to the tutor, "Take your rest." So there's kind of a Sabbath celebration at the end. This is the most novel-like chapter of the Emile, and I just wanted to preface my remarks about Book 5 by saying, I don't think that we should look to Rousseau for policy answers, for answers to policies with respect to the relations between the sexes or any other subject, really, because he had his problems and his advantages in 18th century Europe, and we have our own problems and our own advantages, and we can't really attempt to mush together the two different eras, at least in terms of public policy. But I say this because I think that our inclinations are going to be to disagree with Rousseau on the question of sex. And perhaps that's a reason, one more reason to read him, because you could say that every era, every age is in danger of forgetting something, and that it might be important to take our most cherished values and scrutinize them, even to be skeptical of them, by looking at the way in which Rousseau addresses these questions. In our era, there is a big swath of at least elite opinion, which suggests that there are no natural differences that have to be taken into account or that really matter between men and women, and or between gay and straight, for that matter. At the same time, I mean, in fact, we could go further and say that in our era, there's quite an attack on the notion of nature itself. Not only are there no natural differences that matter, maybe some tell us there is no nature at all. There are social constructs or the way in which we put together our relations with one another. But we don't really have to worry about nature. And from a certain perspective, I don't think this is necessarily your perspective, I'm just sort of throwing it out there. The idea of nature, which sets limits on what we ought to do, might even be regarded as an affront, because we do not like limits, and we do love equality. And we don't therefore, I mean, as Tocqueville pointed out to us, we don't therefore like anything that might stand in the way of an ever more perfect equality. And so we're going to go easily down a certain road, and Rousseau requires us to think about things in a different way. So what I'd like to do then, with respect to Book 5, is to talk about several specific topics. First, Rousseau's treatment of the difference between the sexes. Second, Rousseau's treatment of the education of girls, the proper education of girls. Third, Rousseau's discussion of Sophie. And fourth, Rousseau's, Emile's study abroad program. So we can talk about that too. And then his marriage. Okay, so in book 5, Rousseau lets us understand that although he had said in book 1, you can't form a man and a citizen at the same time, and he was interested in forming a man, he now tells us that Emile is going to become a citizen. So he goes from man to citizen. And therefore, his education is not complete until he is prepared to make that journey. I'm going to read something from the top of page 416 of this book, this edition, just to give us an overview of what Rousseau says in book 5. He says, if I've been able to make these essays useful in some respect, it is especially by having expanded at great length on this essential part of the education, omitted by all others, and by not letting myself be rebuffed in this enterprise by false delicacies or frightened by difficulties in language. So sex education is, or the erotic education, eros, is what Rousseau lays claim to. If I have said what must be done, I have said what I ought to have said. It makes very little difference to me if I have written a novel. A fair romance or novel it is indeed, the romance or novel of human nature. If it is only to be found in this writing, is that my fault? This ought to be the history of our species, of my species. You who deprave it, it is you who make a novel of my book. So that this is, Rousseau is suggesting that what he calls the nascent passion in Emile, the only one he is ever going to feel intensely in his entire life, has to be guided correctly in order for him to be happy and in order for the education to be complete. So Rousseau starts out then by discussing the difference between the sexes as he sees it. Now, ultimately, when Emile goes to become a citizen, he is going to become a husband and a father. And we could say that the family, which is where Rousseau's educational journey takes Emile, is not especially respected in Rousseau's time, certainly not among the elites. Rousseau says Emile is a man, Sophie is a woman. They are not prodigies, although these days you almost have to be a prodigy just to belong to your own sex. And you could say that not only is Rousseau's era anti-family, Plato is also anti-family in the Republic. And Rousseau takes direct and explicit issue with Plato's Republic because of the elimination of the family and in Plato's understanding. And Rousseau began this kind of competition with Plato in his first major published writing, The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, when he says that someone needs to come along to complete the work of that so great a thinker as Plato, or rather to correct the work of such a great thinker. It is the case that Plato's dialogue, The Statesman, shows that for the statesman, matchmaking is the highest political enterprise. And so I'm not sure that no one has ever brought up the subject that Rousseau is talking about. But so for Rousseau, the issue is going to be how to prepare a meal for married life. Rousseau had many critics, feminists of his day, and of a little bit later, tiny bit later, in 1792, that's when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she sets Rousseau's book, Emile, squarely in her sights. She finds it pretty much disgusting. And it's very interesting how she proceeds, because she has little snippets from the Emile and then her comments on it. And I will read one of those in a moment. And today, feminists of various waves of feminism are also severe critics of Rousseau. Again, that may be a reason why we should compel ourselves to take a second look at Rousseau. Rousseau says if you just looked at the physical aspect of sexuality rather than love, the physical aspect, what you see is between male and female, strength on the one side, weakness on the other. This means, says Rousseau, that woman is made to please man. Now, if he ought to please her in turn, and I mean, you could take it sexually, but I think he means in every way, like becoming a lovable man. If man has to please women in turn, it is due to a less direct necessity, but it is a necessity. Women are endowed, because of their weakness, because of their vulnerability, with, according to Rousseau, modesty. Modesty in its basic sense simply means hiding, concealing. Something you might do because you are vulnerable. Something you might do because there are very different consequences of sex for men and women. Maybe not so much today, but even today. So the best way, according to Rousseau, and this is where things begin to change and women become the governors of men. The best way to animate the strength of men is by resistance, so that she must always say no, whether she means no or not. But this would be a pretty terrible thing, says Rousseau, if her modesty made her unhappy. I mean, if she's not allowed to articulate her needs, and she doesn't really have to for sex to take place, she would end up being the slave of a man rather than his equal, or rather his superior. So we have to dig in a little bit to this question of modesty. And the way in which Rousseau does it, I think, is meant to be funny. Oops, I forgot something that I should have said earlier. The reason why Rousseau dislikes what Plato says about men and women in the Republic is because he wants to argue there has to be a natural basis upon which to form civic ties or political bonds. You have to be a citizen because you can think of that as an outgrowth of being a husband or a wife or a mother or a father. Okay, so in order to change a purely physical reaction or physical action, circumstance into love, women put up resistance. But sometimes that resistance is only apparent. They hide so as to be caught. And Rousseau says this is important for men because what they really want from women is not conquest. What they want is consent. And they never quite know whether that's what they have. Do they have the surrender of her will or not? So the way in which, again, Rousseau kind of glosses this situation is to distribute between the two sexes the instruments of the weapons of politics or war as touted by Machiavelli, force and fraud. the fox and the lion. Men have one, women have the other. It's a natural talent, says Rousseau. Guile is in particular given to women so that they will never be men's slave, but always their equal or their superior. And he gives this example. It's two little children whom he apparently saw. One was little children in France are not allowed to ask for food. They're not allowed directly or indirectly or to ask for anything really at the table. So a little boy had been completely forgotten at the table and was given nothing, and he was sitting in front of an empty plate. So he asked somebody to please pass the salt. And according to Rousseau, that's all that the boy could come up with. A little girl, however, 6 years old, who he claims to have seen, a little glutton, had many dishes provided for her at the dinner, but there was one that she particularly wanted, and they'd forgotten to give her that one, and she wasn't allowed to ask. And so what she did in her sweetest possible voice was to go around the table and say, I've had some of that one. I've had some of that one. And then she pauses dramatically over the dish that she didn't have some of, and they see, and she lowers her eyes, and of course they give it to her. So according to Rousseau, little girls are as good at this kind of fraud or guile as women. He also says you should never ask women about this talent because our constraining institutions may have taught them to sharpen their wits. So, to give some other examples of what looks like a kind of flirtation or coquetry among girls and women as a way to use or to accept having to be modest, but nevertheless not allowing modesty to get in the way of their getting what they want. He gives an example of Galatea, who throws an apple at the shepherd and then apparently runs into the willows in order to get away from him. But the story is she just ran into the willows so he would run after her and see her and find her, catch her. And Mary Wollstonecraft says, well, of course, it's France. In France, they have to cover over all of their gross vices with all of these refinements. And 10-year-old girls in France have already learned to coquette. So it's like the verb to crochet, to coquette. They've already learned this because it's France. But according to Mary Wollstonecraft, it's not a good idea. Rousseau says, what would you have Galatea do? Run back to the shepherd and say, I only ran away so you would run after me? No, that would be a kind of lying. But for her to make use of guile in order to get what she wants, and she can't say it directly, is not lying. It's just being herself. Let's see. Little girls and women do not need to be asking, what is it good for? The utilitarian question that Emile asks all the time. Rather, girls should be questioned about, and they should learn how to ask or think about, what effect will it have? If I do this or say this, what effect will it have on the person to whom I am talking or with whom I am interacting? Now, when Rousseau talks about the education of girls, there are a lot of parallels with Emile's education. A lot of noise, a lot of games, a lot of races, appealing to her idea of pleasure, her idea of interest, always keeping things in appropriately with her age. the same thing as for Emile. But there is one big difference, and I think you might say this is even decisive, that for man, opinion is the grave of virtue. But for women, opinion is the throne. In other words, according to Rousseau, women always have to care how they appear to others. They always have to take into account the opinions of others, the public, the prejudices of the public. It's just the way things are, because, again, it has something to do with her vulnerability. But Rousseau also says, what if the public prejudice points in one direction and her inner sentiment points in another direction? Then she's going to have to find an arbiter to decide who wins, the public prejudice or her own inner sentiment. And for this reason, Rousseau says, it's absolutely necessary to cultivate her mind. She must know you can't keep her locked up in a harem. She must, as Tocqueville points out or describes the American girl, she is given enlightenment. She's put in a position where she can always tell if there are seducers or traducers out there. She is going to be able to know who they are, and that families want to educate young women in what is out there truly in the world, so that they will know how to respond if necessary. Rousseau also says, and I think this is very interesting too, that this question, what effect will it have? It's very important for him as well. And this is not the only time in which Rousseau inserts some conversation about really about himself and about the way in which someone in his position must know the same arts as women. He's not in a position to use force. And one of the things that he says here in book 5 is that the art of writing is a subset of the art of pleasing. Rousseau had said that the laws don't give enough authority to women, but they certainly don't give enough authority or any authority to philosophers like Rousseau. And therefore, the art of pleasing, the art of writing, is not a frivolous art if it allows the truth to be heard. So that part of what Rousseau has to do, and does even in this book, in which there are a lot of, in this chapter especially, a lot of delightful things. Rousseau, I left my clock, okay. Rousseau practices the art of pleasing by means of the art of writing. Okay, so I've said a little bit about the sexes as he divides them, and also, I mean, the whole point of the differences between the sexes is that they will eventually be united into one moral person. And Rousseau says, in everything not connected to sex, men and women are the same. In everything that is connected to sex, they are related, but they are different, sort of apples and oranges. You can't really compare them. Okay, so the next part of book 5 goes into the description of the meeting between Sophie and Emile and how, in fact, Sophie was found. Everything, it looks like everything was prearranged by Rousseau. The meeting, where it's going to take place. I mean, Rousseau admits, I took Emile to search for a wife in places that I knew she wasn't going to be found. I wanted him to learn about women, and so I took him to Paris, but I knew that there would be no Sophie there. I had long since found Sophie in a little rural hamlet living with her parents. Rousseau said that he originally thought that he might raise Emile and Sophie together from childhood. But then he says, I decided that would never work because you can't tell about the suitability of characters or people to each other at that young an age. I mean, you have to wait until their tastes and likes and dislikes, in fact, develop. And so it turns out that Sophie lives with her parents, who represent in this book, I think, the model of a happy and durable marriage, long-standing marriage. The father was rich, the mother was an aristocrat, and they made a match. And then the father lost his riches, and the mother consequently lost her position because her family abandoned her. And so now they've been living in their retreat with their only daughter, Sophie, perfectly happy because they fell in love before they were married, and they really are in sync with one another. They have the same taste, they have the same loves and likes and dislikes. Sophie is introduced to us Sophie is introduced to us as the incarnation of ancient virtue. I mean, she lives on a farm. Her mother has no other lady's maid but herself. Her father has no other butler. She can do all of the work in the household, but she is presented to us as I said, as almost a perfect incarnation of ancient classical Greek virtue. This love of virtue is her dominant passion. She believes that women who are virtuous are practically the equal of angels. And we are told that she is not only scrupulously clean, she is pure. There are certain things she's willing to do, but she hates the kitchen. And you can guess how she feels about the farmyard, the barnyard. She hates those things. She'd rather throw her dinner out than get a spot on her cuff. She has a very, very high opinion of herself. And she doesn't want to be declared guilty by association with weak women. And so consequently, not only is she imperious, she is also censorious about other women. You know, there's a phrase, to be chaste as Caesar's wife, and that is Sophie. She is chaste as Caesar's wife. She would be chaste until her last breath, says Rousseau. If she doesn't say anything about you, that's a sign that she is judging you badly. And everybody knows what that means. Now, she is a very, very precocious young woman. And so when she's 15 only, her parents call her to them and tell her it's time for you to consider getting married. You're a big girl now. She's only 15, but her bearing, her willingness to do anything to help her beloved parents, you know, even her haughtiness in a way is a sign that she seems to be mature. And one of the things that happens in this little telling about Sophie is that little story about Sophie is that it's as if her parents her father especially, tried to graft onto this example of ancient virtue, modern liberty, modern political theory. Because her father tells you, unlike other parents, I'm not going to pick your husband for you. Yes, you'll have to consult with us about certain things, but you, Sophie, can pick your own husband. I trust in your reason. It doesn't matter how poor he is. You are poor, and so you probably shouldn't set your sights too high. Now, of course, in the meantime, Sophie has been reading a book, and that book is by the modern novelist Fenelon, and it's a retelling of the story of Ulysses' son Telemachus and his tutor mentor, and the person with whom he falls in love, Eucharis. So Sophie has been reading the novel, and she has fallen in love with the hero of the novel. She hasn't told anybody. But her father has said to her, okay, Sophie, let's have you go visit your aunt in the city, and you can pick out anyone whom you like to be married to. I trust you. I know you love us and you want to support us. And Sophie has a very ardent temperament. In fact, she's unstable in certain ways. Rousseau says she has a mania for virtue. You might almost say she's a fanatic for virtue. And she goes to the city. She tells her mother, there's nobody to whom I'm not attracted in the city, and there's nobody to whom I am attracted in the city. I see all of these people and I think, none of you is Telemachus. He must exist. And if he doesn't exist, okay, he's a character in a novel, but I'll just take somebody who resembles him. But you didn't form me for a man of my times. And I can't find anybody among these monkeys whom I want to marry, because I'm not looking just for a date. I'm looking for a husband for life. And so little by little, she comes home, she becomes depressed. She's even more enclosed in her bedroom. She won't talk to anyone. Her father is getting annoyed. And he says to her, I told you you could pick whomever you want. What are you doing? And her mother says, she says, Mom, I'm dying because I want to love, but I can only do this within marriage. And her mother also becomes impatient and says, just pick somebody. And Sophie becomes, as Rousseau writes, more and more attached to her fantasy for being persecuted for it. It's like she's in a cult, in a religion. And this is how fanaticism grows. I mean, I think that Rousseau is, describing this. It would have been better for Sophie had her father said, I'm going to arrange a match for you, because Sophie can't admit to looking for a partner, let alone find one. She finally confesses to her mother that she is in love with the hero in the novel, and it's really too late, because just when they think she might be coming around, Sophie dies. And so Rousseau says, by elevating her soul and over-activating her imagination, I have deranged her. And there was a real girl like this Sophie, whom I'm calling Sophie number 1, who did die. It's just that her name wasn't Sophie. So then there's a break in the text, and Rousseau says, I was wrong. I'm going to go back to the drawing board, so to speak, and I'm going to revive Sophie for less of an imagination, less elevation, but a happier destiny. This Sophie, Sophie 2, although she also reads the novel about Telemachus, when she actually sees Emile in the flesh, she thinks that he is Telemachus. So she's, much more earthy. I don't know what her parents could have done. One possibility, they could have, let her make mud pies, or give her science, give her something to counteract that overactive imagination that turned her into some kind of fanatic. But this new Sophie has something in common with the other one. She too is rather imperious. She can be capricious. She makes demands on Emile, and Emile obeys them. The rules of their association, I mean, they live 7 miles away and they have to walk all the time. And if the weather is bad, Sophie says they can't come. So, they spend a lot of time going and coming and not so much time in the actual presence of Emile and Sophie. But Sophie can be demanding, but it is clear that the rules of the courtship, which are set at this time in book 5, come from the tutor. The tutor and Sophie become very close to each other, and they have secrets. They talk to each other. And this is one of the times in which they've set the rules. So Sophie, as the romance begins, it is rather charming, I think, how they relate to one another. And we are told that Sophie, yes, she believes that she's going to take the vow to obey her husband, but she obeys him like a minister in a state who is demanded to do what she actually wants to do. And this is another kind of Machiavellian thought. If you have a really good minister, that person may be in charge. She does agree, Sophie, through several iterations of their courtship, she does agree to marry Emile at one point and for one reason only. She agrees to marry him when she believes that she cannot change him. She cannot make him, under any circumstances, renege on his marriage vows. He will keep his promises to her no matter what. She is reluctant to marry him, as she admits to the tutor, in part because she is poor. And if she marries a wealthy noble, he might come to hold it over her that he is raising her up with the marriage. And she doesn't want that. Her pride can barely allow the idea that she might be giving her husband something to hold over her in some way. And so, of course, you can imagine what Emile says under these circumstances. Who needs money? Who needs position? I work as a carpenter. My skills are in my hands. I'm happy to throw it all away. Let's do it right now. And of course, the tutor says to Emile, I'm sorry you don't understand anything about her, because if she is afraid, you might, hold it over her in some way because you're raising her up. Just imagine what she might think or what she would be afraid of if you impoverish yourself for her. She would never let that happen. So you can't get rid of your wealth or your title, but you can, through everything that you do, overcome her resistance, overcome her reluctance by making it clear that your wealth means nothing to you. Just by being the real Emile, show her your nobility of soul. Show her how much you would do anything for her. Show her the kind of person that you are. Now, there is one episode that more than any other, I think, shows how this comes to pass. And it is the episode that precipitates Sophie's sudden desire to marry Emile. She doesn't like Emile to come early, and she won't tolerate his coming late when they have an appointment. He has to be there on time. And, woe betide the man who keeps her waiting. So she's expecting to see him. They have an appointed time, but Emile and the tutor do not show. They do not show all through the night. And in the morning, they send a message saying that they're fine, because Sophie had thought the only reason why they're not here, they must be dead, right? I mean, they would never insult me in any other way. So she tells them when they come to see her, she's very, very cool, very, very cold, one might say. And they have to explain what happened. And Emile does the explaining. And Rousseau says, Emile uses a tone that is a little more firm than I might have expected from him, because he tells her, the story is a really, really good one. And it certainly would excuse anything else. But what happened is they were walking along, because they're walking, they don't ride horses, they walk. And because horses are for rich people. And so, again, this is part of Emile's showing that he doesn't care about wealth. They see that a man who is coming back to his farm, a peasant, has fallen off a horse and broken his leg, and he cannot be put back on the horse. So they have to leave the horse there. They make a stretcher with their arms, and they bring him back to his little hut, where they see that his wife is in labor and is about to give birth to a child. So again, they have a lot to do. Emile gets a second bed. He goes back and gets the horse. He rushes for the doctor. The doctor helps the woman have the child, but there's great pain and disorder in the little cottage. And so anyway, Emile explains this with a certain firmness to Sophie and saying, I love you, Sophie. You can make me die of pain, but the rights of humanity I must hold above yours, and I will never forget them for you. And immediately after making that speech, Sophie, who has been so bashful that she wouldn't even, and so kind of strict that she wouldn't even allow him to kiss the hem of her dress without, express permission, Sophie rushes to him and kisses him on the cheek, and then again, and says, please, I give you my hand in marriage. I will try to merit the honor of being your wife under those circumstances. And those circumstances combined with the illustration to book 5, which is a picture of Circe, the enchantress, and Ulysses. And it says, or it is explained in the text by Rousseau, that Circe gives herself to Ulysses, whom she cannot transform. She had transformed all of his companions into pigs, but she could not change Ulysses because he had been given a drug. And that's a question. Is that the reason why Emile is able to stand up for human rights? Because he has been given a drug in the sense of the education supplied by the tutor. In any case, we can see that Sophie has fears and she has foresight. What if he doesn't always love me? I mean, this is the time in which we are madly in love. There's something very intoxicating about the way in which their courtship is described. There's also something that has a little warning in it. I mean, Rousseau says of them They are weaving flowers and garlands around the happy bond which shall unite them until they die. And that should remind you, as I'm sure it does, of the flowers on the chains in the first discourse, or the discourse on the arts and sciences, when Rousseau says the reason why French people, especially the elite, don't rebel against despotism is because of the flowers on the chains. You know, they don't feel the chains because they're preoccupied with the high culture, the politeness, and everything else that goes along with living in Paris or going to court. So Sophie has a presentiment that perhaps Emile will not always be this way. And that's the person she wants, is the person, in spite of her moods, the one person whom she cannot change, because when he gives his word, he means it. And so that's the basis for their relationship. And the rest of, oops, I'm just going to come to some kind of close here. The rest of book 5 is dominated by the other shoe dropping. Way back in book 4, Rousseau tutor had said to Emile, I want you to give me the authority to tell you what to do, even if it hurts badly. And he uses, just at the moment that Sophie has been won, he uses it to say, you must leave Sophie now, or in a week, and go away for, as it turns out, 2 years. Like Ulysses, he goes on a journey and then comes home. But this journey, this study abroad, is really about politics. First of all, Emile reads the social contract. So he gets a summary of Rousseau's book, The Social Contract. So he gets an idea of how things are supposed to be. And then together, tutor and student travel Europe, not the cities of Europe, not the glamour spots of Europe, but the provinces where you can really see national differences still, where people are not the same. And where there are not that many pretty girls. They go on this trip with the view toward finding a home, someplace where Emile and Sophie could live, because it could be anywhere. And they take the novel Telemachus from Sophie, and they use that on their journey when they leave the social contract world and go to visit real political life. Let's see how real states are. Let's see the different ways in which human beings have of living together in some kind of slavery. And they travel, Rousseau says, like Plato, Thales, and Pythagoras. They want to know. They have no other interest but in knowing. And they want to cast off national prejudice. They want to discover human beings in terms of their likenesses and their dissimilarities. And what they produce, Rousseau says, is something that doesn't belong to any particular nation or any particular era. What they find is the common science of the wise. So that's how Plato, Thales, or Pythagoras would have traveled. And that's how Emile and the tutor traveled. The novel Telemachus really does critique real politics under the guise of using these ancient characters. And so we don't know what they talk about when they read the novel together. Rousseau doesn't show us their criticism of actual states. He sort of leaves that there. And the one other thing that he says, I think that is important in this with respect to travel is that this idea, well, looking for a home is the pretext in order to acquire this political education. But Rousseau says making Emile fall in love before we went traveling is an idea I got from a real person, a real tutor who was English. I saw them. I didn't understand English, but at one point, the tutor is reading a letter to the person he's tutoring, John, and it's in English, and so I can't understand it. But I see after the letter is done, I see that John pulls off these lace cuffs he's been wearing and throws them in the fire or does something with them. And he asks the tutor to explain that. And the tutor says, well, John is betrothed to a lovely young woman named Lucy back in England. And he was wearing these lace cuffs that were made by a lovely lady from Venice, whom they happened to meet on their travels. And Rousseau, or the tutor Rousseau, asks, what happens then is that it is reported that someone wanted to help Lucy finish the cuffs. And so she did. And as soon as that woman left, Lucy decides to tear out the sewing, the crocheting, the lace making of that other woman, like Penelope. She wants to be the only one responsible for every stitch. So John realizes Lucy really loves me, and I better not mess this up by dallying with the lady from Venice. And so then Rousseau says to the tutor, you figured this, you arranged this all in advance, didn't you? And the tutor says, no, I didn't. And Rousseau can't understand it. I mean, why would you leave something this great to chance? So he makes Emile fall in love before they travel, for the reason that perhaps that Emile might cool if he stayed away for 2 years and had no real excuse or no real motivation to return home. And so he does return home. He calls the tutor his father, and he asks him on the night that he finds out that Sophie is pregnant, he asks him to remain with the young people and be their guide, and finally says to the tutor, take your rest. And there are a couple of other things I could bring up, but I've already gone over the time, and I want to be able to hear some questions. So, okay, thank you so very much. And there are many things that you will find if you continue to read on your own. And thank you so much for listening and participating. It was a great gift to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. Our first question, someone who gave a wonderful anecdote about the notes that they had scribbled from the time in their taking your seminar, mentioning that they had many things underlined with the comment "grr" next to it in part 5. They wanted to know, what would modern day Sophie be? Is it possible to have a Sophie if the gender binary is dismantled?
Well, in terms of, Rousseau insists that if you are going to have a happy family, a happy marriage, and I'm sure that this applies to LGBTQ people as well, you have to have a taste for the domestic pleasures. You have to enjoy family life and children and so on. As we hear many people talking about today, that the pandemic has allowed them to be at home with their families, especially men, but not only men. and working from home, and that it's brought a new kind of joy into their lives. And even in the seminar, I don't think that the young men or young women in the seminars that I taught were offended by the notion of a long-term relationship with one person who is your true companion. So okay, if we got rid of the gender binary, we couldn't exactly have Sophie because Sophie and Emile are paired. But if, and again, I don't want to speculate too much on what Rousseau might say. It's under his influence that we have come to extend equality, the Marriage Equality Act. I mean, I think that's part of the influence of Rousseau himself. And when President Biden wants to make sure that perfect equality and non-discrimination goes to the LGBTQ community, I mean, there's a little criticism from some people who think that maybe women's sports might suffer a little bit, but I think people today are prepared to work that out. So I guess if you thought it was a binary that was based entirely on choice, you probably couldn't get a Sophie. But I have, I don't know, when you look at married couples, or people who are in love, it does sort of feel like the same old story, the fight for love and glory. I mean, I see, maybe this is, there's that quotation from Horace, you can try to expel nature with a pitchfork, but it always comes back, not necessarily to bite you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be exclusive. As I said, it's under the influence of Rousseau that we have become as egalitarian as we are. So yes, I'll just leave it there. Any other questions?
Yes, there are a few others. We'll just take two more since we're cutting a little close to time here. Someone asked, they're wondering about the possibilities for interpreting Emile as an allegory of self-examination leading to redemption, to recover or cultivate one's inner Emile.
Yes, and I absolutely think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, it's not just an allegory, but it's part of the common science of the wise to be able to see in Emile the human condition or the human self, the human beings. At the end of the Emile, there is actually a little phrase where Emile seems to say, okay, I am going to stay in France. That's where I'm going to build my home. I was born here, and that's where I'm going to stay. It doesn't really matter if there are no actual laws like in the social contract. There are facsimiles of laws, and I can live with those. What I will do is, in a sense, build a regime in my heart, which is how the Republic ends. If there will be no model city such as that presented in the Republic, but you can build in your soul something like a just city or a beautiful city. You can build that in your soul. And Emile says something like that too, but I'm just not sure that I don't want to exempt Rousseau from all responsibility for contributing to the attitudes that led to the French Revolution and maybe the terror. Not that I think he did, but I think he wanted to alter our view of things, change our tastes, give Emile and give us more democratic sensibilities, more of an ability to relate to those who are lowly. And that is a kind of democratic evaluation. So, and under those circumstances, it would not be surprising if people were to say, why little hamlets? Why can't the democratic enterprise be spread throughout Europe? And Rousseau predicts that there will be revolutions and the end of monarchies. Yeah. Okay.
That dovetails really nicely with our last question. Someone asked, what do you view as the biggest takeaway from Emile as relevant to modern politics?
Don't have utopian expectations. Because it's easy to talk about model cities and beautiful cities and so on, but the experience that Emile gets as he travels abroad and learns some of the details of political life, I think that is important for political leadership. So I think that Emile could be made into a leader in his community and even in the larger world. And one thing that you might want to read along these lines is the sequel to Emile. And I mean, it's not a sequel in the obvious sense, in another way, the sequel to Emile, in which Rousseau intended to publish it as like a piece of theater, not with Emile, but it has become a work that people read, and there is some direct political activity in that sequel. And so you might want to look at that too for future reference. Thank you again, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And thank you especially to Professor Jensen for sharing all of your wonderful knowledge with us. This has been a fantastic series. So I think everyone will join me in saying this has been a wonderful series of Tuesdays for many of us. So again, thank you so very much. And for anyone who missed it, as always, we will be posting our recording on our website and sending it out to you all via email sometime later this week. So again, thank you. And please join us for one of the other events we have this semester. And if you have other folks who you would like to see featured, please feel free to send me an email. My email is wallace1, or if you forget, just alumni@kenyon.edu. And we would love to hear your suggestions for future events. So thanks again and have a great evening.
Thank you so much for this beautiful gift. Thank you. Bye.